Chapter 1. You're sitting there on the edge of the bed with your phone face down, shoes still on, lights low, and there's nothing technically wrong. No argument, no drama, no cheating story to tell your friends. She's in the other room watching something you don't care about, comfortable, settled, assuming tomorrow looks exactly like today. And what's bothering you isn't anger. It's the quiet relief you feel when you imagine being alone. Not lonely. Alone. Free. Undisturbed. Able to do what you want without checking in, without explaining, without carrying someone else's emotional weight. That relief scares you, so you push it down and call what you have good. You tell yourself you're lucky. You tell yourself she's not doing anything wrong. You tell yourself relationships aren't supposed to feel exciting forever. You tell yourself this is what stability looks like. And maybe all of that is true on paper. But paper doesn't live with you. Paper doesn't wake up in your body. Paper doesn't notice that you move slower now, that you hesitate more, that you've stopped imagining a bigger life because maintaining this one takes up just enough energy to keep you from reaching. You don't say any of this out loud. You just keep saying she's good, as if good is some kind of moral shield. Here's the part you don't want to admit. If being single sounds better than being with her, then good was never good enough. Not because she's bad, not because she failed, but because the standard you're pretending to live by doesn't match the life you actually want, and the longer you ignore that gap, the more it costs you. Not all at once, slowly, quietly, in ambition, in clarity, in self-respect. You wouldn't accept this logic anywhere else. You wouldn't keep a job you didn't like just because the boss wasn't abusive. You wouldn't live in a city that drained you just because the rent was reasonable. You wouldn't call a life good if every day felt like maintenance instead of momentum. But when it comes to relationships, men lie to themselves in a very specific way. They confuse not being mistreated with being fulfilled. They confuse peace with stagnation. They confuse loyalty with fear of leaving. You hear guys say it all the time. She's good, she's cool, she doesn't trip, she's not like other girls. And when you listen closely, none of that is about what she brings to the man's life. It's about what she doesn't take away. She doesn't cause problems. She doesn't argue much. She doesn't embarrass him. That's the bar. Not inspiration, not growth, not contribution. Just absence of pain. And when absence of pain becomes the standard, you sign up for a life that never demands greatness from either of you. Think about how women talk when they're honest. They don't say he's fine, so I'll stay. They don't say he's not doing anything wrong, so I guess this is it. They talk about height, ambition, lifestyle, leadership, direction. They talk about how a man makes them feel about the future. They talk about whether being with him elevates their life. And if the answer is no, they leave. They don't apologize for it. They don't explain it as morality. They just say it's not what they want. Men, on the other hand, get shamed for even thinking this way. You're told to be grateful. You're told you're asking for too much. You're told no one's perfect. And again, all of that is true, but it's also irrelevant, because perfection isn't the question. The question is simple and brutal. Is your life better with her than it is without her? Not theoretically, not eventually, right now, in your body, in your day-to-day, in your sense of possibility. If the honest answer is no, then staying isn't noble. It's dishonest. Dishonest to her and dishonest to yourself. Because you're not staying out of love. You're staying out of comfort and fear. Comfort because it's familiar. Fear because leaving would force you to stand alone and take full responsibility for your life again. And that responsibility is heavy when you've been coasting in good enough for too long. There's a story that sticks with me because it's so ordinary it almost gets missed. A man I knew had been with his girlfriend for years. She cooked sometimes. She didn't cheat. She didn't yell. Everyone liked her. On paper, she was good. But every time he talked about his future, his voice flattened. Every time he talked about travel, business, risk, or change, he'd add a quiet qualifier. Maybe later, maybe after this, maybe once things settle. One night, after a long conversation, someone asked him a simple question. If you woke up tomorrow and she was gone, would your life get worse or freer? He didn't answer right away. He laughed. Then he went quiet. That pause told the truth before he ever did. He stayed another year. Nothing changed. Same routines, same conversations, same low-grade dissatisfaction. And when they finally broke up, it wasn't dramatic. No betrayal, no explosion. Just an admission that they had been maintaining something that never wanted to grow. And within 6 months, his life expanded in ways he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. Not because she was holding him back intentionally, but because good enough had made him comfortable enough to stop demanding more from himself. That's the trap. A woman doesn't have to sabotage you to limit you. She just has to be comfortable enough for you to stop pushing. And men who haven't required much from women their entire lives mistake basic decency for value. If she doesn't hit you, if she doesn't insult you, if she shows up occasionally, you treat that like gold because you've been starved for standards. You've been trained to accept crumbs and call them peace. This is where the standard needs to change, not into cruelty, not into entitlement, into clarity. She doesn't have to be bad to not be right. She doesn't have to fail to be released. And you don't owe anyone a lifetime just because they didn't harm you. Relationships are not charity. They are partnerships. And partnerships are evaluated on contribution, not just compliance. If this is making you uncomfortable, that's the point. Discomfort is what shows you where you've been lying. If you've ever caught yourself saying she's good while daydreaming about being alone, pause and hit like on this video. Not for me, for you. That click is you admitting something you've probably never said out loud. The truth is, if being single feels better, then the relationship is already over in your nervous system. You're just keeping it alive with language. You're calling it loyalty. You're calling it patience. You're calling it being a good man. But a good man doesn't waste his own life pretending contentment. A good man doesn't stay where his standards have quietly died. This chapter isn't telling you to leave. It's telling you to stop lying. Stop using good as a shield against hard decisions. Stop pretending women don't have standards when you've watched them apply those standards ruthlessly to men. Stop believing you're asking for too much when all you're asking for is a life that feels alive. Sit with that tonight, not angrily, honestly. If the idea of being alone feels lighter than the idea of staying, that's information. And information, when you stop ignoring it, changes everything. Chapter 2. What nobody tells you is that once you accept good, your entire life recalibrates downward without asking permission. You don't notice it right away. There's no sudden collapse, no dramatic loss. Things still function. Bills get paid. Routines stay intact. From the outside, it even looks stable. But internally, something goes quiet. The part of you that used to push, that used to want more, that used to feel restless in a productive way, starts going numb, not dead, sedated. You stop asking certain questions, you stop challenging certain assumptions, you stop imagining certain versions of yourself because those versions don't fit neatly into the relationship you're maintaining. You don't say this out loud, but you feel it every time you choose the couch over the gym, the familiar over the risky, the predictable over the unknown. You tell yourself, it's maturity, that you've calmed down, that you've outgrown ambition. But that's not what it is. You've just negotiated your standards down to match the environment you're in. Men underestimate how much a woman shapes the ceiling of their life, not through control, but through tolerance. What you tolerate in her, you eventually tolerate in yourself. If she's fine with mediocrity, you start making peace with it too. If she's comfortable staying where she is, you stop feeling urgency to move. Not because she tells you to, but because there's no friction pushing you forward anymore. And friction isn't bad. Friction is how momentum gets created. Remove it, and things settle. Permanently. This is why "she's good" is such a dangerous phrase. It shuts down inquiry. It ends the conversation prematurely. It's a way of saying, don't look any deeper, don't question this, don't ask what it's costing me. And the cost is rarely obvious. It's not that she ruins your life. It's that she makes a smaller one feel acceptable. And a smaller life, once accepted, is incredibly hard to outgrow because it doesn't hurt enough to force change. You see this play out with men all the time. The guy who used to talk about starting something, traveling, pushing himself. A year into a good relationship, his language changes. He starts talking about schedules, compromises, timing. He says things like, maybe later, maybe after this phase, maybe once things calm down. And they never calm down. Life doesn't get less demanding. It just gets more habitual. And habits solidify faster than dreams if you're not careful. Here's the part that stings. A lot of women don't require much from men because they don't have to. Men have been trained to accept less, to be grateful for peace, to feel guilty for wanting more. Meanwhile, women are encouraged to want the best possible outcome for themselves. Height, income, lifestyle, ambition. No one tells them they're asking for too much. They're told to know their worth. Men are told to be reasonable. And reasonableness is how you end up settling into a life that doesn't excite you. Think about the language shift. When a woman says she wants more, it's framed as standards. When a man says the same thing, it's framed as dissatisfaction, as ingratitude, as commitment issues. And that framing works. It keeps men quiet. It keeps them staying longer than they should. It keeps them convincing themselves that wanting more is a flaw instead of a signal. And signals are meant to be listened to, not silenced. There's a double standard most men sense but don't articulate. A woman can leave a man who's good because she wants great, and it's celebrated as self-respect. A man who does the same is questioned, shamed, or told he's unrealistic. But the truth doesn't change just because the reaction does. If the relationship doesn't beat being single, it's not enough. Not morally, practically. Because being single isn't a punishment. It's a baseline. It's the control group. And if your relationship doesn't outperform the control group, the experiment has failed. You don't owe anyone permanence just because they meet minimum requirements. Minimum requirements are for entry, not for lifelong partnership. And yet men treat them like they're the finish line. She's loyal, she's kind, she doesn't cause drama, all good things, none of them sufficient on their own. Because none of them answer the real question. Does being with her make you better or smaller, clearer or duller, more yourself or less? A man I spoke to once said something that stuck. He said, I wasn't unhappy. I was just slowly disappearing. That's what good relationships do when they're not right. They don't break you. They blur you. They soften your edges. They lower your urgency. And you don't notice until years pass and you realize the version of yourself you respected most exists only in memory. Not because you failed. Because you compromised quietly for too long. And here's where men get defensive. They say, so what? I'm supposed to chase perfection. No, you're supposed to chase alignment. A woman doesn't need to be flawless. She needs to inspire movement. She needs to add pressure in the right direction. She needs to make being with her feel like an upgrade to your life, not a maintenance plan. If she doesn't, staying isn't loyalty. It's avoidance of the unknown. The unknown is what men fear more than dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction you can manage. You can numb it. You can rationalize it. You can bury it under routine. The unknown demands courage. It demands that you stand alone for a while, that you face yourself without distraction, that you take full responsibility for your happiness instead of outsourcing part of it to a relationship that's merely functional. And most men would rather live half alive than face that reckoning. If this chapter is hitting a nerve, share it with someone who keeps saying it's fine while slowly checking out of his own life. Not to convince him, just to remind him that fine is a choice, not a destiny. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Not because this channel will tell you what to do, but because it will keep you from lying to yourself when comfort starts masquerading as wisdom. Good doesn't ruin your life overnight. It does something worse. It makes you forget what great felt like. Chapter 3. You start noticing it in small moments, the kind that don't feel dramatic enough to justify a decision, so you let them pass. You're out with friends and someone asks what you've been up to, and you hesitate before answering, not because nothing's happening, but because you don't feel like explaining why nothing feels urgent anymore. You give a vague response. Same routine, same work, same plans. And as you say it out loud, you hear it. The flatness, the absence of hunger. You didn't lose ambition. You postponed it to keep the peace. There's a version of you that only comes out when you're alone. The one that stays up late thinking about what could be different. The one that feels a low burn of restlessness when things get too predictable. That version of you hasn't disappeared. He's just been sidelined. Every time you choose comfort over friction, he steps back. Every time you tell yourself this is just how relationships are, he goes quieter. And because nothing is technically wrong, you keep ignoring him. But ignoring him doesn't make him go away. It just makes him resentful. You tell yourself you're being responsible, that you're choosing stability, that excitement fades, and this is what grown men do. And again, some of that is true, but responsibility without fulfillment turns into quiet bitterness. Stability without direction becomes stagnation. And when you look honestly, you're not choosing stability because it's aligned. You're choosing it because it's familiar, because it doesn't demand a leap, because it doesn't risk embarrassment or loneliness, because staying is easier than explaining why you left something that looked fine from the outside. This is where men lie to themselves the hardest. They say, "She's not holding me back. She's supportive. She doesn't stop me from doing anything." And maybe she doesn't actively block you, but she doesn't pull you forward either. She doesn't require a higher version of you. She's content with who you are right now, and that contentment feels nice until you realize it's removing all pressure to become more. Growth needs pressure. Every man who has built something meaningful understands that. Remove the pressure, and the structure stops rising. Think about the men you respect most, not the loud ones, the ones whose lives actually expanded over time. They weren't surrounded by comfort. They were surrounded by standards, internal and external. They chose environments, partners, and routines that demanded something from them. And when men choose partners who don't challenge them, not through nagging, but through expectation and example, they start shrinking to meet the environment instead of expanding beyond it. That shrinkage is subtle. You don't feel weaker. You feel calmer. And calm can be seductive when you're tired. You might recognize this in how you plan now. You don't plan far ahead. You don't think in bold terms. You think in logistics. Vacations that fit schedules, goals that don't disrupt the relationship, risks that can be reversed quickly. You tell yourself you'll push harder later, but later never arrives, because later requires dissatisfaction strong enough to overcome inertia. And good relationships don't create dissatisfaction. They create just enough comfort to keep you from moving. Here's a moment that matters. Picture a woman you were with briefly in the past, not perfect, maybe even flawed, but she challenged you in a way that woke you up. You felt sharper around her, more alive, more driven. You thought more clearly, you trained harder, you took risks, and maybe it didn't last. Maybe it was chaotic. But notice the contrast. That relationship demanded more of you, not because she was better, but because she wasn't settling. And when you're around someone who isn't settling, you feel exposed if you are. Now compare that to your current situation. The emotional temperature is lower. The expectations are softer. You're not required to bring much. And in that softness, you've started accepting less from yourself, not consciously. Gradually, you stopped expecting excellence because nothing around you was asking for it. And men don't rise in a vacuum. They rise in response to pressure they respect. There's a story that plays out quietly all the time. A man stays because she's good. Years pass. He builds a life that works but doesn't inspire. Eventually, resentment creeps in, not at her, at himself. He feels trapped but can't explain why. From the outside, everything looks fine. From the inside, he feels like he's living someone else's life. And when it finally ends, people are shocked. They say it came out of nowhere. It didn't. It came from years of unspoken compromise. This is why men who stay in just good relationships often become passive. They stop leading. They stop initiating. They let life happen to them. And then they wonder why attraction fades, why sex feels like effort, why connection feels dull. Attraction doesn't die because of time. It dies because of stagnation. And stagnation is the natural outcome of environments that don't demand growth. You don't need chaos to feel alive. You need challenge. You need a reason to sharpen yourself. You need to feel like your presence matters. A woman who is merely good doesn't provide that. She provides peace without momentum, and peace without momentum eventually feels like suffocation to a man who still has ambition in his bones. If you're listening to this and you feel that tension between comfort and desire, that's not immaturity. That's self-awareness trying to break through routine. If you've ever caught yourself thinking, "I'd rather be single than explain why I'm unhappy," that's a signal, not to act rashly. To be honest, if this chapter is hitting you, hit like. Not because it feels good, but because it feels true. Truth doesn't soothe, it clarifies. The danger isn't that she's bad. The danger is that she's acceptable. Acceptable enough to keep you where you are. Acceptable enough to delay hard decisions. Acceptable enough to turn years into routines before you realize you've been living at half capacity. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Chapter 4. Eventually, the question stops being about her at all. That's the part nobody warns you about. At first, all your thoughts orbit the relationship. Is she enough? Am I wrong for wanting more? Should I just be grateful? But if you sit with it long enough, if you don't drown it out with distractions or routines or other people's opinions, the focus shifts inward. You start asking yourself something much harder. What kind of man stays in a life that doesn't feel alive just because it's comfortable? And once that question shows up, you can't shove it back into the corner. You notice how carefully you manage your own dissatisfaction, how skilled you've become at lowering the volume on it. You stay busy, you scroll, you joke about being tired, you tell yourself every man feels this way sometimes. And maybe they do. But there's a difference between passing doubt and chronic misalignment. Passing doubt comes and goes. Misalignment lingers. It hums under everything you do. It shows up when you're alone. It shows up when you imagine the future and feel nothing. It shows up when the idea of starting over feels lighter than the idea of continuing as you are. What makes this so difficult is that nothing is forcing your hand. There's no villain, no crisis, no external pressure demanding a decision. And without pressure, men delay. They postpone. They wait for a sign big enough to justify action. But life doesn't hand out permission slips for hard choices. It just keeps moving. And while you're waiting for certainty, time is quietly choosing for you. Another year passes. Another routine locks in. Another version of you becomes harder to access. You might tell yourself you're being loyal, that staying proves character, that leaving without a dramatic reason makes you selfish. But loyalty to what? To comfort, to familiarity, to the image of being a good guy who sticks it out. Loyalty means something when it's aligned with truth. When it's not, it turns into self-abandonment. And self-abandonment doesn't look dramatic. It looks like a man slowly forgetting why he used to respect himself. There's a subtle bitterness that creeps in when you live this way. Not explosive anger, a quiet edge. You become less patient, less generous in spirit, less inspired. You start nitpicking small things because the big thing feels unsayable. You feel irritated by her presence without knowing why. You withdraw emotionally, then feel guilty for withdrawing. And from her side, none of it makes sense. She hasn't changed. She's still good. And that's the problem. Good hasn't grown. Good hasn't evolved. Good hasn't pulled you forward. It's just stayed. Men don't talk enough about how much they need to feel chosen by life itself, not just accepted, chosen, engaged, tested. When your relationship doesn't ask much of you, when it doesn't challenge your edge or your direction, you start feeling like you're living on standby, like your real life is waiting somewhere else. And that feeling doesn't go away by being more grateful. It goes away by being more honest. Here's the truth most men dance around. You don't actually want a woman who's merely pleasant. You want a woman who makes you rise, who makes you sharper, who makes you take your own potential seriously, not through pressure or nagging, but through presence, through her standards, through the way she lives her own life, through the way being with her feels like stepping into something more demanding, not less. If she doesn't do that, if she doesn't raise the bar simply by existing as herself, then staying with her will slowly lower yours. And before you turn that into blame, understand this. It's not her job to fix you. It's your job to choose an environment that supports the man you're trying to become. A relationship is an environment. And environments shape behavior. They shape ambition. They shape identity. You already know this. You just haven't applied it here because doing so would force a decision you've been avoiding. There's a moment that happens when men finally accept this, and it's quieter than they expect. It's not rage, it's relief mixed with grief. Relief because the confusion ends. Grief because you realize how long you've been negotiating against yourself. You see all the moments you ignored, all the signals you downplayed, all the times you chose comfort over alignment. And instead of beating yourself up, you feel something closer to resolve. A calm understanding that this can't continue if you want to respect yourself again. A man once told me that leaving his just good relationship felt like jumping off a ledge into fog. He couldn't see what was next. He couldn't guarantee anything better. But he said staying felt like slowly sinking into a life he didn't recognize, and the fear of the fog was less than the fear of disappearing. That's the choice most men eventually face, not between good and bad, between stagnation and uncertainty. And uncertainty, for a man who still wants to grow, is often the healthier option. You don't need to villainize her to leave. You don't need to justify yourself to anyone who isn't living your life. You don't need to wait until resentment poisons everything. You just need to stop pretending that good is enough when your own body is telling you it isn't. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. And clarity, even when it hurts, is kinder than dragging out a situation where neither of you gets the life you could have had. If you've made it this far and you're feeling that mix of heaviness and calm, that's not confusion. That's recognition. Recognition that you've been standing at the edge of a decision for longer than you want to admit. If this conversation is forcing you to be honest with yourself in a way you've avoided, subscribe. Not because this channel has answers, but because it refuses to let you hide behind language when your life is asking for action. The final truth is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. A relationship has to beat being single, not on paper, not in theory, in reality, in how you feel waking up, in how you imagine your future, in how you move through your days. If it doesn't, then staying isn't strength, it's fear dressed up as loyalty. And once you see that, you can't unknow it. Chapter 5. There's a moment after all the thinking, after all the rationalizing, after all the conversations you rehearse in your head but never have, where the noise dies down and what's left is painfully simple. You realize you've been negotiating against your own life, not against her, against yourself. You've been trying to convince yourself that wanting more is a character flaw instead of a responsibility. And once that lands, it doesn't feel empowering. It feels sobering. Because now you can't pretend you don't know. You start seeing how often you've accepted language in place of truth. You've accepted "she's good" as if it's a conclusion instead of a placeholder. You've accepted relationships are work as if work is supposed to drain the life out of you instead of build something meaningful. You've accepted it could be worse as if avoiding pain is the same thing as choosing joy. And none of that makes you a bad man. It makes you a man who's been trained to settle quietly and call it maturity. What really stings is noticing how selective that settling is. You don't settle like this everywhere. You don't train halfway and expect full results. You don't half build a career and call it ambition. You don't half respect yourself and call it integrity. But in relationships, men get praised for enduring instead of choosing. You get told that staying is proof of strength, even when staying requires you to mute parts of yourself you respect. That praise is poison. It keeps you in situations that don't demand your best and slowly trains you to stop demanding it from yourself. At some point, you realize the fear wasn't about losing her. The fear was about being alone with no excuses, alone with your standards intact, alone with your ambitions unbuffered by routine, alone with the question of what you'd actually build if no one was there to absorb your energy or soften your urgency. That's a heavier weight than loneliness. Loneliness is temporary. Responsibility is permanent. And most men choose the former because it hurts less immediately. You might notice a shift in how you listen to other men once this clicks. When a guy says he's staying because she's good, you hear the hesitation underneath it. You hear the relief he feels when he doesn't have to justify wanting more. You hear the way his voice changes when he talks about the future versus when he talks about the relationship. And you recognize it because you've lived it. That recognition isn't judgment, it's clarity. You know exactly where he is because you stood there too. There's something important to say here, and it doesn't get said enough. Wanting a woman who makes your life better than being single is not entitlement, it's discernment. Entitlement says, I deserve something without earning it. Discernment says, I'm responsible for choosing what I allow into my life. Women practice discernment openly. They're encouraged to. Men practice it quietly and then feel guilty for it. That guilt is learned. It's not moral. It's social. And once you see that, you can decide whether you want to keep carrying it. This doesn't mean every relationship has to feel electric every day. It means the relationship should feel additive, not subtractive. It should feel like an environment where your best traits get sharper, not duller. Where your ambition feels supported, not inconvenient. Where your standards don't feel like threats. If you have to constantly negotiate your desire to grow in order to keep the relationship stable, the stability is costing you more than you think. Think back to the version of you that felt most alive, not happiest, alive. The version that felt engaged with life, hungry in a focused way, curious about what was next. Notice what kind of environment surrounded that version of you. Notice whether comfort was the priority or challenge was. Notice whether you were being pulled forward or allowed to coast. That comparison isn't meant to shame you. It's meant to orient you. It shows you what conditions bring out the man you respect. There's a quiet dignity in choosing yourself without turning it into a spectacle. You don't need speeches. You don't need to demonize anyone. You don't need to rewrite history to justify your choice. You can simply tell the truth to yourself first, that this doesn't beat being single, that you don't feel expanded here, that staying would require you to keep shrinking parts of yourself you don't want to lose. That truth doesn't make you cruel. It makes you honest. And honesty is the foundation of any life that doesn't feel hollow. You might worry about regret, about wondering later if you made a mistake. That fear is normal. But regret doesn't come from choosing alignment. It comes from ignoring it. Regret comes from waking up years later and realizing you knew and stayed anyway. That kind of regret doesn't announce itself loudly. It sits quietly in the background of your life and colors everything. Choosing uncertainty over stagnation doesn't guarantee happiness, but it preserves self-respect. And self-respect is the one thing that makes any future happiness possible. There's a story that ends this conversation better than advice ever could. A man once told me that after leaving a relationship that was good, he felt panic for about 2 weeks. Not loneliness, panic. Because for the first time in years, his life belonged entirely to him again. No one to negotiate with, no one to consider before making decisions, no one absorbing his excess energy. And then something strange happened. His days started filling up, his goals got sharper, his standards returned, not because he found someone better immediately, because he finally stopped lying to himself about what he wanted. That's the part most men miss. Leaving isn't about finding someone else. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about making room for a life that actually demands something from you. Whether another woman eventually enters that life or not becomes secondary, because now the relationship is with your own potential. And that relationship, unlike a just good one, doesn't tolerate excuses for long. If you're listening to this and feeling both heavy and strangely clear, that's not confusion. That's alignment beginning. Alignment feels uncomfortable at first because it removes the cushion of compromise, but it also feels clean, like finally standing upright after slouching for years. If this video put language to something you felt but avoided, like it. Not as approval, but as acknowledgement. And if you want more conversations that refuse to let you hide behind comfort when your life is asking for courage, subscribe. This channel isn't here to make you feel better. It's here to make you honest enough to build a life that actually feels worth living. In the end, the standard is simple and unforgiving. A woman has to make your life better than being single. Not marginally, not someday. Now. If she doesn't, staying isn't virtue, it's avoidance. And once you accept that, the path forward stops being confusing. It becomes demanding. And demand, for a man who still wants more, is exactly what brings him back to life.